Have you ever felt like you had to choose between staying silent to stay safe or speaking up to do what's right? That moment when your heart pounds so hard you can hear it in your ears, when your palms become slick with sweat, when your mouth goes dry, and every instinct in your body screams, "Run!" But something deeper, something stronger, whispers, "Stay." Maybe it was that moment in the boardroom when you watched a colleague being unfairly blamed for someone else's mistake, and you had the information that could clear their name. But speaking up might cost you the promotion you'd worked years to earn. Maybe it was standing in the school hallway, watching the new kid getting bullied, knowing that one word from you could stop it, but also knowing it might make you the next target. Maybe it was sitting at the family dinner table hearing relatives spread gossip that you knew was destroying someone's reputation, and you had to choose between keeping the peace and defending the truth. Or perhaps it was one of those deeper moments when your faith was being mocked at work, and you had to decide whether to laugh along to fit in or stand firm in what you believed. When everyone around you was cutting corners, taking shortcuts, doing whatever it takes to get ahead, and you had to choose between compromising your integrity or potentially watching others pass you by. That paralyzing fear of rejection that starts in your stomach and spreads through your whole body. The terror of being hated, excluded, cut off from the people and opportunities that feel essential to your survival. The crushing weight of potentially losing everything that matters to you. Your job, your reputation, your relationships, your security, your future. But here's what makes it even more complicated. It's not just about you. Often these moments come when other people are depending on you. When your silence doesn't just protect you, it abandons them. When your safety comes at the cost of their suffering. When your comfort requires their continued oppression. What is it about human nature that makes us choose silence over struggle? Why does the voice of fear often speak louder than the voice of conscience? Is it possible to be faithful to God while still getting along with the world? Can we serve both heaven and earth without betraying either? These are the questions that have haunted humanity for thousands of years. Questions that have tested the souls of men and women in every generation, in every culture, in every era of human history. And they're exactly the same questions that faced a young Jewish girl whose story would change not just her own destiny, but the course of an entire empire, the survival of a whole people, and the trajectory of history itself. If you've ever felt trapped between two worlds, the world of who you really are and the world of who you think you need to be to survive, then you understand something essential about the human condition. If you've ever had to hide parts of yourself to be accepted, if you've ever wondered whether one person can really make a difference against overwhelming odds, if you've ever felt like you were living a double life just to make it through each day, then you have more in common with a girl named Esther than you might think. This isn't just an ancient story about a beauty queen who got lucky and saved her people. This isn't a fairy tale about a poor girl who married a king and lived happily ever after. This is a story about the most fundamental choice every human being faces. Will you live for yourself, or will you live for something greater than yourself? Will you choose safety, or will you choose significance? Will you preserve your life, or will you pour it out for others? This is a story about finding the courage to stand when no one else will. It's about discovering that God places us exactly where we need to be, exactly when we need to be there for purposes we never could have imagined and often don't want to accept. It's about learning that being chosen by God doesn't mean life gets easier. It means your life gets infinitely more meaningful, dramatically more challenging, and eternally more significant. Today, I promise you this story will fundamentally change how you think about courage. It will revolutionize your understanding of faith. It will transform your perspective on your own purpose in this world. Because courage, real courage, isn't the absence of fear. It's taking action in the presence of overwhelming fear. It's not about being fearless. It's about being faithful when fear is screaming at you to run. And sometimes, often, the most unlikely people become the most powerful when they stop relying on their own strength and start trusting in the strength of the God who called them. Sometimes the weakest among us carry within themselves the potential to change everything. Sometimes the most broken, the most overlooked, the most underestimated people are exactly the ones God chooses to accomplish His most important work. Let me take you back 200 to 500 years to ancient Persia, to the greatest empire the world had ever seen, to a time when the Jewish people faced complete extinction, to the story of a girl who would learn that being chosen by God is both the greatest privilege and the most terrifying responsibility any human being can bear. Her birth name was Hadassah, which means myrtle tree in Hebrew, a small, fragrant, evergreen plant that thrives even in the most difficult conditions, that stays green when other plants wither, that releases its sweetest fragrance when its leaves are crushed. How prophetic that name would prove to be. But the world would come to know her by another name, Esther, which means star in Persian. From Hadassah to Esther, from the myrtle tree to the star, from the hidden to the revealed, from the protected to the protector. This is the journey we're about to take together. She was an orphan, a word that carries weights and wounds we can barely imagine. Both parents gone before she could form lasting memories of their faces, their voices, their love. Raised by her older cousin Mordecai, after losing her father and mother when she was just a child, she knew the particular loneliness that comes from never quite fitting anywhere, from always being grateful for kindness that should have been yours by right, from carrying the invisible wounds of early loss. Imagine the questions that must have filled her young mind, the questions that probably kept her awake at night staring at the ceiling of Mordecai's house. Why me? Why did my parents have to die? Where would I be if they had lived? Who would I have become if I had grown up in their house with their love, surrounded by their hopes and dreams for my future? And underneath those questions, the deeper, more painful ones. Why did God let this happen if He cares about His people? Why didn't He protect my family if He has plans for me? Why did they have to start with such devastating loss? Am I being punished for something? Is this what I can expect from life? That everyone I love will eventually be taken away? These weren't abstract theological questions for a young girl trying to make sense of her world. These were the daily realities that shaped how she saw herself, how she related to others, how she understood God, and how she approached the uncertain future stretching ahead of her. This was the harsh reality for thousands of Jewish families living in exile throughout the vast Persian Empire. They had been violently torn from their homeland during the Babylonian conquest, scattered like seeds in the wind across an empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia, covering over 2 million square miles and ruling over an estimated 50 million people. They were foreigners in every sense of the word, different in their faith, different in their customs, different in their dietary laws, different in their worship practices, different in their values and worldview. Every single day, they walked the delicate, exhausting line between preserving their faith and identity and surviving in a culture that didn't understand them, didn't particularly want them, and could turn against them at any moment. They were always guests, never truly at home, always one political shift away from persecution, always one bad ruler away from exile, or worse. For Hadassah, this tension wasn't just cultural, it was deeply personal. In public, navigating the streets of Susa, interacting with Persian neighbors, learning Persian customs and language, she had to present herself as someone who belonged, someone who wasn't a threat, someone who could be accepted. But at home with Mordecai in the safety of their private walls, she learned the stories that formed the core of her identity. The God who called Abraham out of Ur, who delivered the Israelites from Egyptian slavery, who gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, who established King David's kingdom, who promised that his people would never be ultimately abandoned no matter how dark their circumstances became. These weren't just ancient stories to her. They were her family history, her spiritual DNA, the foundation of her understanding of who she was and whose she was. She learned the prayers her ancestors had prayed, the songs they had sung, the festivals that marked the rhythm of faithful life, the dietary laws that reminded them daily that they were set apart for God's purposes. But she also had to learn the survival skills that every minority community develops: when to speak and when to stay silent, how to blend in without disappearing entirely, how to show proper respect for the dominant culture without betraying your own deepest convictions, how to build relationships with people who might never fully accept you, how to prosper in a system that wasn't designed for your success. How do childhood wounds shape us? This question would follow Hadassah throughout her life. Can God actually use our deepest pain to prepare us for our greatest purpose? These weren't questions she would have been able to articulate as a young girl, but they were realities she was living every day. The Persian Empire under King Xerxes, known in Hebrew as Ahasuerus, was the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. Imagine wealth beyond anything we can comprehend today. Palaces that took decades to build and employed thousands of workers, gardens that were considered among the wonders of the world, feasts that lasted for months, displays of power and luxury that were designed to overwhelm visitors and ambassadors from around the known world. The royal palace at Susa wasn't just a residence, it was a statement. Every detail, from the massive columns to the intricate mosaics, from the exotic animals to the rare spices, from the precious metals to the elaborate ceremonies, was designed to communicate one message: this empire is more powerful than anything you've ever imagined, and defying it is unthinkable. For Jewish families like Hadassah and Mordecai's, every day required careful navigation. How much could they participate in Persian society without compromising their faith? How could they honor the earthly king while remaining faithful to the heavenly king? How could they prosper in Babylon without becoming Babylonian? How could they sing the Lord's song in a foreign land without losing either the song or their sense of home? These weren't just practical questions. They were spiritual and emotional minefields. Too much assimilation, and they risked losing their identity as God's people. Too much separation, and they risked persecution, poverty, or worse. Every Jewish family had to find their own balance, make their own compromises, live with their own internal tensions. Some chose complete assimilation, changing their names, abandoning their dietary laws, intermarrying with Persians, essentially disappearing into the larger culture. Others chose complete separation, creating isolated communities that had minimal contact with their Persian neighbors, maintaining their traditions, but limiting their opportunities for influence or economic success. Mordecai chose a middle path, one that would prove crucial for what was to come. He worked within the Persian system, holding a position of some responsibility and respect at the king's gate. But he never forgot who he was, or whose he was. He participated in Persian society while maintaining his Jewish identity. He prospered in exile without losing his hope for eventual return. He built relationships with Persians while teaching Hadassah the faith and traditions of their ancestors. This was Mordecai's daily struggle as he raised Hadassah, and it shaped every decision he made about her upbringing. He taught her the Hebrew scriptures, the stories of their people, the prayers and traditions that connected her to centuries of faithful ancestors. But he also taught her practical wisdom, how to read people and situations, how to navigate complex political and social dynamics, how to build trust and influence, how to survive and even thrive as a minority in a majority culture. He wasn't just teaching her to be a good Jewish girl. He was preparing her to be a Jewish woman who could make a difference in the world, who could represent her people with dignity and effectiveness, who could bridge the gap between two cultures without losing her soul in the process. Mordecai wasn't just Hadassah's cousin. He was her father figure, her protector, her teacher, her spiritual guide, and her closest connection to the family and heritage that had been taken from her so early. He had chosen to pour his life into hers, sacrificing his own comfort and opportunities to ensure she had a future. Every decision he made was filtered through love, not just emotional affection, but the kind of covenant love that commits to another person's highest good, regardless of the personal cost. He could have seen her as a burden, an obligation he had to fulfill. Instead, he saw her as a trust, a precious gift from God that had been placed in his care for purposes that might not be revealed for years or even decades. He taught her that being Jewish wasn't just about ethnic heritage or religious practices. It was about being part of God's plan to bless all the nations of the earth. He helped her understand that their exile wasn't evidence of God's abandonment, but part of a larger story of redemption that might require their family to play a role they couldn't yet understand. Who are the Mordecais in our lives? The people who sacrifice their own interests to invest in our development, who see potential in us that we can't see in ourselves, who prepare us for purposes we don't yet understand. How can we become spiritual fathers and mothers to the next generation, investing in people who might one day change the world? Watch how God works. He uses the people around us to prepare us for our calling. He placed Hadassah with Mordecai, not by accident, but by divine design. Even in the midst of loss and exile, even when circumstances seem random or cruel, God is always at work, preparing His people for the purposes He has in mind. This is one of the most important truths we need to understand about how God operates in our lives. He's always preparing us, always positioning us, always working through our relationships and circumstances to develop in us the character skills, wisdom, and spiritual depth we'll need for whatever He has planned. Often we don't see it at the time. Often it feels like we're just trying to survive, just making the best of difficult circumstances, just dealing with whatever life has thrown at us. But looking back, we can see the patterns. We can see how that difficult boss taught us patience and perseverance, how that financial struggle developed our faith and resourcefulness, how that betrayal by a friend taught us discernment and the difference between acquaintances and true allies, how that season of loneliness drove us deeper into relationship with God, how that failure humbled us and made us more compassionate toward others who struggle. For Hadassah, growing up as an orphan with Mordecai wasn't just a matter of survival, it was preparation. She was learning to live between two worlds, to honor both human authority and divine authority, to influence without compromising, to adapt without losing her core identity. She was developing the emotional intelligence, cultural fluency, and spiritual grounding she would need for a role she couldn't have imagined. Then everything changed, and it changed in a way that would seem impossible if it weren't recorded in the pages of Scripture and confirmed by secular historical sources. Queen Vashti, the queen of the Persian Empire and one of the most powerful women in the world, made a decision that would alter the course of history. During a lavish banquet where King Xerxes and his officials had been drinking and celebrating for days, displaying the wealth and power and glory of the empire to hundreds of nobles and officials from across the known world, the king made a request that would precipitate a crisis. The text tells us that on the seventh day of the feast, when the king's heart was merry with wine, in other words, when he was drunk, he commanded 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before his guests to display her beauty. She was to wear her royal crown, and most biblical scholars believe the implication was that she was to wear only her royal crown, essentially being paraded naked before a room full of intoxicated men like a trophy to be admired. But Vashti refused. In a culture where women had virtually no power, where defying the king could mean death, where obedience was not just expected but demanded, Queen Vashti said no. She would not be degraded, humiliated, or objectified, even by the most powerful man in the world, even if her refusal cost her everything. The king's advisors immediately recognized this wasn't just a domestic dispute. It was a threat to the entire social order. If the queen could defy the king, what would stop other women throughout the empire from defying their husbands? If authority could be questioned at the highest levels, where would the questioning stop? Their recommendation was swift and decisive. Queen Vashti must be deposed, and her defiance must be made an example to women throughout the empire. So, they convinced the king to issue an irreversible decree stripping Vashti of her royal title and banishing her from his presence forever. To replace her, there would be an empire-wide search for a new queen. Beautiful young women from every province would be brought to the capital city of Susa for an elaborate selection process. Are all opportunities really from God? How do we distinguish between God's opportunities and worldly temptations? These are questions that would become crucial for understanding what happened next. Here's one of the most mysterious and important truths about God's sovereignty that we see throughout Scripture. He can use even the wrong decisions of others to accomplish His perfect plan. He can take human sin, pride, foolishness, and selfishness, and weave them into His larger purposes without becoming tainted by the evil or compromising His holiness. Vashti's situation was tragic, a woman who stood up for her dignity and paid a terrible price. The king's reaction was sinful, a man who let pride and peer pressure drive him to make a decision he probably regretted later. The advisor's counsel was politically motivated, men who cared more about maintaining power structures than about justice or mercy. But God, who wastes nothing and can redeem everything, was using all of these flawed human choices to create an opening for His person to be positioned in exactly the right place at exactly the right time for the crisis that was coming. This doesn't mean God caused or approved of the injustice done to Vashti. It means that God's purposes are so vast and His wisdom so deep that He can work through even the worst of human nature to accomplish His good plans. When the decree went out that beautiful young women throughout the empire would be brought to the palace for an elaborate, year-long preparation process with the possibility of becoming the next queen, it reached every corner of the Persian Empire, including the Jewish community in Susa. Mordecai faced what may have been the most difficult decision of his life. He had raised Hadassah with love, protection, and careful guidance. He had shielded her from the worst aspects of their exile, provided for her needs, and prepared her for a future that he hoped would be both prosperous and faithful. Now she was being swept up in a process that he couldn't control, couldn't protect her from, and couldn't predict the outcome of. Should he try to hide her attempt to keep her from being selected? Should he help her escape to another part of the empire where she might not be found? Should he try to bribe officials or use his position at the king's gate to exempt her from the selection process? Or was this somehow impossibly part of God's plan for her life and for their people? The text doesn't give us insight into Mordecai's thought process, but we can imagine the sleepless nights, the agonized prayers, the wrestling with God over what to do. This was his daughter in every way that mattered, the child he had raised and loved and protected. Now she was being taken from him, thrust into a situation he couldn't control for purposes he couldn't understand. But Mordecai had spent years learning to trust God in impossible circumstances. He had maintained his faith through exile, through loss, through the daily challenges of being a Jew in Persia. He had learned that God's ways are not our ways, that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, that sometimes the most frightening circumstances are actually the pathway to God's greatest blessings. So, when Hadassah was selected to be brought to the palace, Mordecai let her go. But he also gave her the most important instruction of her life. She was not to reveal her Jewish identity. In the palace, she would be known by her Persian name, Esther. Her heritage, her faith, her true identity would remain hidden. Imagine Hadassah's terror as she was taken from the only family she had known, from the only home she could remember, from the familiar routines and relationships that had given her life meaning and security. She was being forced into a situation she never wanted, thrust into a competition she never asked to enter, for a prize she wasn't sure she wanted to win. This wasn't a voluntary beauty pageant where young women competed for fame and fortune. This was essentially a forced conscription, where the king's officials had the authority to take any woman they deemed suitable regardless of her personal wishes, family situation, or existing relationships. For a Jewish girl who had been raised with strong values about modesty, marriage, and faithfulness, this must have felt like a complete violation of everything she had been taught to value. The Persian palace was like nothing Hadassah had ever seen or imagined. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Courtyards that could hold thousands of people halls, with ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into the sky, decorations made from gold and silver and precious stones that represented more wealth than entire cities possessed. But beneath the beauty and luxury was a complex, dangerous world of political intrigue, competing factions, and unspoken rules that a wrong step could be fatal. Every conversation might be overheard and reported. Every friendship might be a calculated alliance. Every gesture might be interpreted as a sign of loyalty or defiance. And in this world, Hadassah would have to learn not just to survive, but to thrive, all while keeping the most important part of herself hidden. But notice what happened almost immediately. Hadassah found favor with Haggai, the eunuch, who was in charge of all the women in the selection process. In a foreign place, surrounded by foreign customs and foreign people, God provided her with someone who would care for her, guide her, and position her for success. This is one of the ways we can recognize God's hand in circumstances that feel overwhelming or frightening. He provides people to help us wisdom to navigate complex situations and favor that we couldn't earn or manufacture on our own. Even in circumstances we don't choose, God provides what we need. Haggai immediately recognized something special about Esther. The text tells us he was pleased with her and showed her kindness, providing her with beauty, treatment, special food, 7 female attendants, and the best place in the harem. This wasn't just professional courtesy. This was someone in authority going out of his way to help a young woman who was far from home and family. When do we know it's God's calling versus just human opportunity? Do we have the right to refuse when God opens doors we didn't ask Him to open? For an entire year, these young women underwent the most elaborate beauty regimen imaginable, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. They learned palace protocols, studied court etiquette, received instruction in music and dance and conversation. They were being prepared not just to meet the king, but potentially to become the most powerful woman in the greatest empire on earth. For Hadassah, now known as Esther, this year must have been an emotional roller coaster. There was probably some relief at discovering she could navigate this new world, some satisfaction in learning new skills and developing new confidence. But there was also the constant stress of hiding her true identity, the loneliness of not being able to share her real self with anyone, and the uncertainty about what the future held. Every day she had to wake up and decide again to be Esther rather than Hadassah, to play a role rather than simply be herself, to hope that no one would ask the wrong questions or notice the wrong details that might give away her secret. But God was at work in ways she couldn't see. He was giving her time to adapt to palace life, to understand Persian culture, to build relationships, to develop the skills and wisdom she would need for what was coming. He was preparing her through circumstances she wouldn't have chosen for a purpose she couldn't have imagined. Here's a truth that will challenge you. Sometimes God opens doors through circumstances we don't want. Sometimes His plan requires us to step into situations that feel uncomfortable, even frightening. Sometimes what feels like being forced into something we don't choose is actually God positioning us for something we couldn't have achieved any other way. This doesn't mean every difficult circumstance is from God or that God causes suffering to accomplish His purposes. But it does mean that God is so wise and so powerful that He can take even unwanted circumstances and use them for our good and His glory if we'll trust Him and cooperate with His work in our lives. Esther's emotions during this time must have been incredibly complex. Fear of the unknown, homesickness for Mordecai and the familiar life she had left behind, anxiety about maintaining her secret identity, uncertainty about what would happen if she wasn't chosen, and perhaps even more, anxiety about what would happen if she was chosen. But there was probably also a growing sense that something bigger than her personal comfort or preferences was at work. As she learned to navigate palace life, as she built relationships with other women and palace staff, as she discovered she had abilities and insights she hadn't known she possessed, she may have begun to sense that God was preparing her for something significant. Why does God often call us when we feel most unprepared? How do we overcome feelings of unworthiness and inadequacy? This is one of the patterns we see throughout Scripture. God specializes in using people who feel completely unqualified for what He's asking them to do. Moses felt too slow of speech to be a leader. David was too young to be a king. Jeremiah felt too young to be a prophet. Mary felt too insignificant to be the mother of the Messiah. God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. He doesn't look for people who have all the answers. He looks for people who will trust Him to provide the answers when they're needed. He doesn't choose people who feel ready. He chooses people who will become ready through dependence on Him. Esther was learning this truth experientially. Every day that she successfully navigated palace life, every relationship she built, every challenge she met was building her confidence, not in herself, but in God's ability to work through her. She was discovering that God's grace really is sufficient, that His strength really is made perfect in weakness, that He really does provide what we need when we need it. When the time finally came for each young woman to spend one night with the king, Esther made a choice that revealed both wisdom and humility. She asked for nothing beyond what Haggai recommended. While other women probably loaded themselves with jewelry and expensive clothing and elaborate accessories, trying to impress the king with external beauty, Esther trusted the guidance of someone who knew the king's preferences better than she did. This simple decision reveals something important about Esther's character that was being developed through this process. She was learning to seek and follow wise counsel, to trust people who had her best interests at heart, to focus on substance rather than just appearance, and to understand that influence comes more from character than from status symbols. When King Xerxes met Esther, he was immediately captivated. Of all the beautiful women who had been brought from across the empire, of all the elaborate presentations and carefully planned encounters, she was the one who won his heart. The text tells us that the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. The orphaned Jewish girl became Queen of Persia, second only to the king in power and influence throughout an empire that ruled over 50 million people. The moment must have felt surreal, like a fairy tale, a dream, something that couldn't possibly be real. But for Esther, the victory was complicated by the secret she still had to keep, and the weight of responsibility she now carried. She was no longer just responsible for her own survival and success. She was now in a position where her decisions could affect millions of people. She had influence, she had never sought power, she had never wanted, and responsibilities she had never trained for. Sometimes you have to rise high before you can serve deep. God doesn't always lift us up for our own benefit. Sometimes elevation is preparation for service that will require everything we have to give. But becoming queen was just the beginning of Esther's real education. Now she had to learn what it meant to live with influence, to carry secrets that could affect entire populations, to make decisions in a political environment where every choice had far-reaching consequences. The crown on her head was beautiful, but it was also heavy. The power she now possessed was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous. The luxury surrounding her was comfortable, but it was also isolating. She was at the center of the greatest empire on earth, but she had never been more alone. Now came the most difficult part of Esther's preparation, learning to live successfully with a hidden identity. Following Mordecai's instruction, she continued to keep her Jewish heritage secret. This meant that every day she had to wake up and choose to be Queen Esther. Rather than Hadassah, the Jewish orphan, she had to participate in Persian court customs, navigate Persian politics, and maintain Persian relationships while keeping the most important part of herself hidden. Imagine the emotional and psychological toll this took. She was surrounded by luxury and power, but unable to share her true self with anyone. She had to smile and laugh at conversations that might include anti-Jewish sentiments. She had to participate in court ceremonies that might conflict with her Jewish convictions. She had to build relationships with people who might turn against her if they knew who she really was. Every meal was a careful navigation, avoiding foods that were forbidden by Jewish dietary laws without drawing attention to her choices. Every religious ceremony was an exercise in appearing respectful while maintaining her inner convictions. Every conversation was a careful balance between building genuine relationships and protecting dangerous secrets. How do we live truthfully in complex circumstances? Is it right to hide our faith or identity to protect ourselves and potentially serve a greater good? This is one of the most challenging questions believers face in every generation. How do we maintain our integrity while living in systems that don't share our values? How do we serve God while also serving earthly authorities? How do we love our neighbors while also protecting ourselves and our families from potential persecution? Esther was living this tension every day, and it was preparing her for the ultimate test that was coming. God was teaching her to live like a secret agent in the world, maintaining her true identity and convictions while learning to operate effectively in foreign territory. But this wasn't compromise. This was strategy. Esther wasn't abandoning her faith. She was positioning herself to potentially serve her faith in ways that would have been impossible if she had insisted on complete transparency from the beginning. Sometimes wisdom requires patience timing and the ability to work within systems to change them rather than simply rejecting them from the outside. During this time, Esther was also developing crucial skills she never knew she would need: political awareness, diplomatic sensitivity, strategic thinking, the ability to read people and situations accurately, and the capacity to influence powerful people without appearing to manipulate them. She was learning the king's personality, what pleased him, what frustrated him, what motivated him, what fears and insecurities drove his decisions. She was building relationships with key people throughout the palace: servants, officials, other members of the royal family. Understanding that influence often depends more on these relationships than on official titles or positions. How do we use power and influence in ways that honor God? Can worldly authority ever be used for heavenly purposes? These weren't just practical skills Esther was developing. They were spiritual disciplines. She was learning to see every relationship as an opportunity to serve God's purposes, every conversation as a chance to plant seeds that might bear fruit later, every decision as a choice between self-interest and God's larger plans. Here's the paradox that Esther was living. Sometimes we have to learn the ways of the world to serve the kingdom of heaven. This doesn't mean compromising our values or abandoning our convictions. It means understanding how systems work so we can influence them for good learning, how to communicate with people who don't share our worldview, and developing the skills necessary to build bridges between different communities. Esther wasn't becoming Persian. She was becoming bilingual, bicultural, capable of operating effectively in both worlds without losing her essential identity in either one. Her relationship with Mordecai had to change significantly during this time. They could no longer meet face to face as they once had. Communication had to happen through intermediaries: servants, messengers, people who could carry information without arousing suspicion. Esther felt the distance, keenly missing the daily conversations, the shared meals, the comfortable familiarity of the relationship that had been the most important constant in her life. But even this forced separation was part of God's preparation. How do we maintain important relationships when circumstances change dramatically? Can we rise high without forgetting where we came from? How do we stay connected to our roots while adapting to new environments? Esther was learning that some relationships can survive and even deepen through physical separation if they're built on something stronger than convenience or proximity. Her connection to Mordecai was based on shared faith, mutual love, and common commitment to God's purposes. These foundations could withstand the practical challenges imposed by her new position, but the separation was also teaching her to depend more on God than on human support. Mordecai had been her primary source of guidance, encouragement, and spiritual strength. Now she was learning to find those resources directly in her relationship with God, preparing her for decisions that even Mordecai wouldn't be able to make for her. God uses even unwanted separations to deepen our dependence on Him and prepare us for responsibilities that require us to stand alone in our faith and convictions. Then came Esther's first real test, though she probably didn't recognize it as such at the time. It seemed like a small incident, but it would prove to be crucial preparation for what was coming. Mordecai, working at the king's gate in his position as a palace official, overheard two of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, plotting to assassinate King Xerxes. These men were part of the king's personal guard with access to the royal quarters and the ability to carry out their plan. If they succeeded, the entire empire would be thrown into chaos. Thousands of people would die in the resulting power struggles, and the Jewish people, already vulnerable as a minority population, would likely face even greater persecution under whatever regime emerged from the crisis. Mordecai faced a choice. He could stay silent and let events unfold naturally, protecting himself and his family from any potential backlash. Or he could risk his own safety to warn the king, knowing that bringing accusations against the king's own guards could backfire catastrophically if he couldn't prove his claims. But Mordecai had learned long ago that remaining faithful to God sometimes requires taking risks for the sake of doing what's right, regardless of the personal consequences. So he reported the plot to Esther, asking her to warn the king and giving credit where it was due. For the first time since becoming queen, Esther had to use her position to do something that carried real risk. She couldn't be certain the king would believe her report. She couldn't be sure that the accused guards wouldn't find a way to retaliate. She couldn't know how the king would react to being told that his own trusted officers wanted to kill him. But she had learned to trust Mordecai's judgment, and she was beginning to understand that her position carried both privileges and responsibilities. So she approached the king carefully and respectfully, and reported what Mordecai had discovered. The king took the report seriously, investigated the claims, and discovered that they were accurate. The conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed. The king's life was saved, the empire remained stable, and Mordecai's good deed was recorded in the official royal chronicles, though he received no immediate reward or recognition. Why does God give us practice runs before the big challenges? How do we recognize small opportunities to exercise faith and build the character we'll need for larger tests? This incident was preparation in several crucial ways. First, it established Esther's credibility with the king as someone who brought him accurate information, rather than gossip or self-serving requests. Second, it gave her experience in approaching the king with difficult news and navigating the political dynamics of such conversations. Third, it demonstrated that she could be trusted to act in the king's best interests, even when doing so carried personal risk. But most importantly, it was building Esther's confidence that God could use her in this role she had never sought. She was beginning to see that her position wasn't just about personal privilege or security. It was about being positioned to serve God's purposes in ways that might not become clear until much later. This is how God works in our lives too. He prepares us for significant callings through smaller acts of faithfulness. He builds our character, develops our skills, and establishes our credibility through seemingly minor decisions and everyday choices. We may not recognize the preparation while it's happening, but looking back, we can see how God was developing in us exactly what we would need for the challenges ahead. Watch how Esther handled this situation. She approached the king with respect and humility. She reported the information accurately without exaggeration or drama. She gave credit to Mordecai rather than trying to take credit herself. She acted quickly once she understood the seriousness of the situation. She trusted that doing the right thing would ultimately lead to the right results, even if she couldn't control or predict the outcome. She was learning that influence isn't about power or manipulation. It's about character, trustworthiness, and consistent commitment to truth and justice. How do we build the kind of reputation and relationships that allow us to have positive influence when it matters most? Must credibility be earned one day at a time through countless small decisions? Sometimes we must serve faithfully in small things before we can be trusted with larger responsibilities. Esther was proving herself worthy of the king's confidence, not knowing that his life, and the lives of millions of people, would soon depend on her ability to approach him with much more difficult news. Her confidence was growing, but it was confidence grounded in God's faithfulness rather than in her own abilities. She was learning that she could make a difference, that God could work through her circumstances and her position, that her unlikely elevation to the throne might actually be part of a larger plan she couldn't yet see. But she was also learning that influence comes with responsibility, that privilege comes with obligation, that being chosen for a position of power means being called to use that power for purposes greater than personal comfort or security. Faith grows through practice, not through theory. Every time Esther chose to act courageously, every time she risked her own safety for someone else's benefit, every time she trusted God with outcomes she couldn't control, her faith was being strengthened for the ultimate test that was coming. But first, the stakes had to be raised. The enemy had to be revealed. The crisis had to develop to the point where courage would be the only option and compromise would mean catastrophe. Enter Haman the Agagite, a man whose pride would nearly destroy an entire people, and whose hatred would create the greatest crisis the Jewish people had faced since their exile from Jerusalem. King Xerxes had promoted Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, essentially making him prime minister of the Persian Empire. With this promotion came a specific command. All royal officials were to bow down and pay honor to Haman whenever he passed by. This wasn't just a sign of respect, it was a form of worship, an acknowledgement of Haman's authority that bordered on idolatry. Day after day, when Haman would pass through the king's gate, all the officials would bow down as commanded. All except one Mordecai the Jew remained standing. Other officials urged him to comply, warning him of the potential consequences, but Mordecai stood firm. When they asked why he refused to bow, he told them simply, "I am a Jew." This wasn't just stubbornness or cultural preference for Mordecai. This was a matter of fundamental religious conviction. As a faithful Jew, he believed that worship belonged to God alone. He could show respect to human authority, but he would not participate in anything that resembled worship of a human being. He would bow to God, but he would not bow to Haman. Why are there enemies that seem irreconcilably opposed to faith? Is it worth standing firm on principle when you know there will be devastating consequences? Here we see one of the fundamental tensions that believers face in every generation, the conflict between ultimate loyalty to God and the demands of earthly systems. Mordecai understood that some things are worth dying for, and the honor and glory that belong to God alone was one of them. But his decision wasn't just about his own convictions. It put his entire family and community at risk. His refusal to bow to Haman would have consequences far beyond his own life. Yet he chose faithfulness to God over safety for himself and those he loved. This is one of the most challenging aspects of living faithfully in an unfaithful world. Sometimes our commitment to God's truth puts other people we love in danger. Sometimes doing what's right according to God's standards creates problems for our families, our communities, our colleagues. The temptation is always to compromise just a little, to find a middle ground that doesn't offend God too much, but also doesn't create unnecessary conflict with the world around us. But Mordecai had learned that there are some lines that can't be crossed, some compromises that cost more than they save, some battles that have to be fought, regardless of the consequences. He had decided long ago that God's glory was worth any sacrifice, and he was prepared to pay whatever price his faithfulness required. When word of Mordecai's defiance reached Haman, his reaction was swift and explosive. The text tells us he was furious, not just annoyed or frustrated, but filled with rage. But it wasn't enough for him to punish Mordecai alone. His hatred extended to all Jewish people throughout the empire. This is the nature of spiritual warfare. It's rarely satisfied with limited victories. The enemy doesn't just want to defeat individual believers. He wants to destroy the entire community of faith. He doesn't just want to silence particular voices. He wants to eliminate the message itself. Haman was cunning and strategic in his evil. He didn't go to King Xerxes with his personal grievance against Mordecai. Instead, he crafted a carefully calculated proposal that would appeal to the king's interests and concerns. He presented the Jewish people as a threat to the empire's stability and unity, describing them as a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Notice how skillfully he framed the issue. He didn't mention Mordecai specifically or reveal that this was motivated by personal offense. He presented the Jewish people as a security threat and a challenge to imperial authority. He made it seem like eliminating them would be good governance rather than genocide. He even offered to pay for the military operation himself, making it appear that he was serving the king's interests rather than his own vendetta. The king, trusting Haman's judgment and perhaps not fully understanding the scope of what he was authorizing, gave him his signet ring and told him to do whatever he thought best. This ring gave Haman the authority to issue decrees in the king's name that were as binding as if the king had written them himself. With this authority, Haman cast lots, called Purim in Hebrew, to determine the most auspicious date for his planned massacre. The lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar, nearly a year away. This delay might have seemed like a small mercy, but it was actually part of God's plan, giving time for his purposes to unfold and his people to prepare. The decree that went out throughout the empire was comprehensive and terrifying. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of every nationality and province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. On that single day, every Jewish person in the Persian Empire, men, women, children, elderly, was to be killed, and their property confiscated by their killers. The reaction throughout the Jewish communities was immediate and devastating. The text tells us that in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Imagine the terror, the despair, the sense of complete helplessness that swept through Jewish families across the empire. Parents looked at their children and tried to imagine how to protect them from an enemy that had the full power of the state behind it. Young people faced the possibility that their lives would be cut short before they had a chance to marry, have families, or fulfill their dreams. Elderly people wondered if they had survived exile and persecution, only to see their entire people destroyed. Why does God allow evil to seem triumphant? How do we respond when facing absolute injustice? How do we maintain faith when it appears that God's enemies are winning and His people are powerless? These are questions that believers have wrestled with throughout history, and they're questions that Esther and Mordecai were about to face in the most personal and desperate way possible. Sometimes it seems like darkness is winning, like the forces opposed to God's people are too powerful to resist, like injustice will triumph and the innocent will suffer, while the guilty prosper. But this is often when God is preparing to reveal His power in the most dramatic way possible. This is when He demonstrates that human schemes, no matter how well planned or powerfully backed, cannot ultimately frustrate His purposes for His people. This is when ordinary people discover that they have been placed in extraordinary positions for exactly such moments of crisis. When Mordecai heard about the decree, his response was immediate and dramatic. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, the traditional signs of mourning and repentance, and went into the city crying out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the king's gate because no one wearing sackcloth was allowed to enter the palace grounds. This wasn't just personal grief. This was prophetic protest. Mordecai was doing what Jewish leaders had always done in times of crisis, calling attention to injustice, appealing to heaven for intervention, and mobilizing the community for prayer and fasting. Esther's servants quickly reported to her what was happening, but initially she didn't understand the full scope of the crisis. When she heard that Mordecai was wearing sackcloth outside the palace, her first instinct was to send him proper clothing, probably thinking this was about some personal problem that could be solved with royal intervention. But when Mordecai refused the clothes, Esther realized something much more serious was happening. She sent her trusted eunuch Hathach to find out what was troubling Mordecai. Through Hathach, Mordecai sent Esther a copy of the written decree and gave her a detailed explanation of what Haman had done and what it meant for their people. Then came the request that would change everything. Mordecai urged Esther to go to the king to make supplication and plead with him for her people. This was the moment everything had been building toward. All of Esther's preparation, all her time in the palace, all the favor she had built with the king, all the skills she had developed, all the relationships she had cultivated. It was all for this moment. The orphaned Jewish girl had become Queen of Persia, so that she could be in position to save her people when they faced extinction. But Esther's initial response was fear, completely understandable, entirely human fear. She sent word back to Mordecai, explaining that approaching the king without being summoned was punishable by death, unless the king extended his golden scepter to show favor, and she hadn't been called to see the king for 30 days. When do we know it's time to act? Are we allowed to be afraid when God calls us to do something that seems impossible or dangerous? Fear is a natural response to overwhelming circumstances, and God doesn't condemn us for feeling afraid. Even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane experienced such intense emotional distress that he sweat drops of blood as he contemplated what lay ahead. The difference between courage and cowardice isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to act in spite of fear when action is required. Esther was facing a choice between her personal safety and the survival of her people. If she approached the king without permission and he refused to see her, she would be executed immediately. But if she didn't approach the king, every Jewish person in the empire, including herself, once her identity was discovered, would be killed in 11 months. But there was something else Esther had to consider, even if the king agreed to see her. There was no guarantee he would be willing to reverse Haman's decree. Persian law stated that royal decrees sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked. Even if the king wanted to help the Jewish people, it might be legally impossible for him to do so. So Esther was being asked to risk her life for a plan that might not work, to save people she had been hiding her connection to, using influence she wasn't sure she possessed, in a political system she didn't fully understand. This is often how God's callings come to us, not as clear, simple requests with guaranteed outcomes, but as complex challenges that require us to risk what we have for what might be to step into uncertainty. Because staying in safety means abandoning others who need our help. God never calls us into situations where He doesn't provide the strength we need, but He also rarely gives us complete information about how everything will work out. He asks us to trust Him with the outcomes while we take responsibility for our obedience. Then came Mordecai's response, words that have echoed through history and continue to challenge believers today. His message to Esther was both a warning and a promise, both a challenge and an encouragement. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will come from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? These words contain profound truths about purpose, responsibility, and the sovereignty of God that every believer needs to understand. First, Mordecai reminded Esther that her position couldn't protect her from the consequences of abandoning her people. Being queen might delay her execution, but it wouldn't prevent it. Once her Jewish identity was discovered, and in a systematic genocide it inevitably would be, she would face the same fate as every other Jew in the empire. There was no safe neutrality in this situation. Second, he assured her that God's purposes would not be frustrated by her refusal to act. If she chose silence and safety, God would raise up deliverance from another source. The Jewish people would be saved, but she would forfeit the opportunity to be part of that salvation, and would likely perish along with the rest of her family for failing to use her position when it was needed most. Third, he challenged her to consider that her entire life story, the loss of her parents, the adoption by him, the selection for the beauty contest, the favor with the king, the elevation to queen, might all have been orchestrated by God for exactly this moment. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Does every position of influence come with moral responsibility? How do we know when this is such a time as this for us? What are we willing to risk for purposes greater than our own comfort and security? These are questions that every person of influence faces, whether that influence is in a family, a workplace, a community, or a nation. Mordecai was telling Esther that her position wasn't an accident, wasn't just a personal blessing to be enjoyed, wasn't simply a reward for her beauty or character. It was a calling, a responsibility, an opportunity to be part of God's work in the world. This principle applies to all of us. Whatever influence we have, whatever position we hold, whatever resources we possess, whatever opportunities we've been given, they're not ultimately for our own benefit. They're tools God has placed in our hands to serve His purposes and bless other people. But Mordecai was also teaching Esther something crucial about how God works. His plans will succeed whether we participate or not. But we have the incredible privilege of choosing whether to be part of His solution or to forfeit that opportunity through self-protection. This is both comforting and challenging. It's comforting because it means the ultimate success of God's purposes doesn't depend on our strength, wisdom, or courage. He's sovereign, and His will cannot be ultimately frustrated by human failure or refusal. But it's challenging because it means we're accountable for how we respond to the opportunities He gives us to serve His kingdom and love our neighbors. God's plans will succeed, but our participation in those plans depends on our willingness to trust Him with outcomes we can't control while taking responsibility for obedience in the situations He places before us. After receiving Mordecai's message, Esther went through what we might call the dark night of the soul, that period of intense spiritual and emotional struggle that often precedes our most important decisions. She had to wrestle with the choice between personal safety and sacrificial service, between staying hidden and risking everything for her people, between the life she had built as Queen Esther and the identity she had been hiding as Hadassah the Jew. Imagine her thoughts during those crucial hours. I'm just one person against the most powerful empire in the world. I'm just a woman in a culture that doesn't value women's voices. I'm just a Jew in a Persian court where my very identity is a liability. What if the king rejects me? What if I die and my people die anyway? What if Mordecai is wrong about God raising up deliverance from another source? What if my death just makes everything worse? But underneath those fears were deeper questions about identity, purpose, and calling. Who am I really? Queen Esther or Hadassah, the Jewish orphan? Can I live with myself if I choose safety while my people face extinction? Have I been placed in this position for such a time as this? What does God require of me in this situation? Why do the most important decisions often come with the greatest internal struggle? How do we know when to put collective interests above personal interests? What does it mean to live faithfully when faithfulness might cost us everything we've worked to achieve? These are the questions that reveal what we really believe about God, about ourselves, about our purpose in the world, and about what ultimately matters in life. They're the questions that separate genuine faith from cultural Christianity, real character from convenient morality, authentic love from self-serving sentiment. But as Esther prayed and sought God's guidance during those dark hours, she began to understand something profound. She couldn't escape her identity or her calling. She had been living as Queen Esther, but she was still Hadassah, daughter of the covenant people of God. She could hide her Jewish identity from the Persian court, but she couldn't hide it from herself or from God. And sometimes being faithful to who God made us to be requires risking everything we've built in this world. In those crucial moments of decision, God gives peace to those who choose obedience over safety, purpose over comfort, service over self-protection. This doesn't mean the fear disappears. It means a deeper assurance develops that doing the right thing is more important than avoiding difficult consequences. Finally, after what must have been an agonizing period of prayer and reflection, Esther made her decision, a decision that would be remembered and honored for thousands of years. She sent this message back to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish." 5 words in English that capture the essence of true courage, genuine faith, and complete surrender to God's will. In Hebrew, the phrase is even more concise and powerful: "V'ka asher avadeti avadeti." Literally, "And as I have perished, I have perished." Are there things worth dying for in this life? What principles, people, or purposes deserve that level of commitment? Why do we need spiritual preparation before taking action that could cost us everything? This wasn't reckless abandon or impulsive martyrdom. This was calculated faith, informed courage, strategic surrender. Esther wasn't just throwing her life away in a moment of emotional intensity. She was making a thoughtful decision to trust God with the outcomes while she took responsibility for doing what was right. But notice that she didn't act alone. She asked the entire Jewish community in Susa to join her in the most serious form of spiritual preparation known to their culture: 3 days and nights of fasting and prayer. This wasn't just a personal decision. It was a community commitment to seek God's intervention and blessing on what they all understood was a desperate, dangerous, but necessary plan. Why is community support so crucial when we're facing our greatest challenges? How does corporate prayer change both us and our circumstances? What happens when God's people unite in seeking His face and His will? Fasting wasn't just about going without food. It was about focusing their attention completely on God, acknowledging their dependence on Him, demonstrating the seriousness of their request, and preparing their hearts for whatever God might require of them. It was a way of saying, "God, we're desperate. We have nowhere else to turn. We're trusting you completely with the outcome, but we're asking you to work through our obedience and courage. When God's people unite in serious prayer and fasting, when they come together with common purpose and complete dependence on Him, He moves in ways that are beyond human explanation or natural possibility. But the 3 days of fasting were also crucial for what was happening inside Esther. During this time, something profound was taking place in her heart and mind. The frightened young woman who had been forced into an unwanted situation was being transformed into a woman of unshakable faith and courage. She was moving from Hadassah, the protected, to Esther, the protector, from one who had been saved to one who would save others from someone who had been shaped by circumstances, to someone who would shape history. This is what happens when we surrender completely to God's will. He doesn't just use us as we are. He transforms us into who we need to be for the work He's calling us to do. He doesn't just give us courage. He makes us courageous. He doesn't just provide strength. He makes us strong. When we choose obedience over safety, when we commit ourselves fully to God's purposes, regardless of the personal cost, He provides supernatural strength, wisdom, and peace that go far beyond our natural capacity. Esther was discovering what every believer learns when they move from casual faith to radical commitment. God is absolutely trustworthy. He never calls us to something without equipping us for it. He never asks us to go somewhere without going with us. He never requires sacrifice without providing grace sufficient for whatever that sacrifice demands. On the 3rd day, after 3 days and nights of prayer and fasting, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace facing the king's hall. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return, the decision that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of an entire people. The royal robes were significant. They represented her official position, her legal standing as queen, her right to be taken seriously by the king and the court. But they were also a statement of faith. She was approaching the king not as a desperate Jewish woman begging for mercy, but as his queen making a request that deserved his consideration. One of 2 things would happen. Either King Xerxes would extend his golden scepter toward her, indicating that she was welcome in his presence and could make her request, or he would refuse to acknowledge her, which would mean immediate execution for violating the law against approaching the king without permission. The tension must have been unbearable. Esther had no way of knowing what kind of mood the king was in, whether he would be pleased to see her or annoyed by the interruption, whether their relationship was strong enough to overcome the breach of protocol her presence represented. But when King Xerxes saw Queen Esther standing in the court, the text tells us that she won his favor. He extended the golden scepter toward her, and she approached and touched the tip of it, the ritual that indicated she was accepted into his presence and could speak freely. Then came the king's generous offer words that revealed how much favor Esther had built with him over the years of their marriage. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." Why does God sometimes make doors open more easily than we expected? How do we recognize God's favor in crucial moments? What does it mean when circumstances align in ways we couldn't have arranged ourselves? When we step out in faith, when we risk everything for purposes greater than our own, welfare. God often opens doors we couldn't open ourselves and provides favor we couldn't earn or manufacture. This doesn't mean every act of faith leads to immediate success or easy victories, but it does mean that God honors courage and blesses obedience in ways that go beyond natural cause and effect. Notice that God had been preparing the king's heart to receive Esther favorably. This wasn't luck or coincidence, or even just the result of Esther's previous relationship building. This was divine orchestration. God had been working on both sides of this crucial conversation, preparing Esther for courage and preparing the king for receptivity. But now came Esther's masterstroke of wisdom and strategic thinking. Instead of immediately revealing her Jewish identity and making her desperate request, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. At the first banquet, when the king again asked what she wanted, promising to give her anything up to half his kingdom, she invited them to a second banquet the following day, saying she would make her request then. This wasn't stalling or indecision. This was brilliant strategy. When do we need wisdom in our approach to difficult conversations? Is timing sometimes more important than courage? How do we balance urgency with effectiveness? Esther was demonstrating several important principles of influence and persuasion. First, she was building anticipation and curiosity. By delaying her request, she was making the king more interested in what she might want. Second, she was creating the right atmosphere for a difficult conversation, a private, comfortable setting where they could talk freely without the pressure of a public audience. Third, she was giving God more time to work on the king's heart and to arrange circumstances that would support her request. Sometimes patience is the fastest route to success. Sometimes the most direct approach isn't the most effective approach. Sometimes wisdom requires waiting for the right moment, even when every instinct is screaming for immediate action. Esther was learning that courage doesn't always mean immediate confrontation. Sometimes it means strategic patience, careful preparation, and trusting God's timing even when delay feels dangerous. But while Esther was implementing her careful strategy, something remarkable was happening behind the scenes that she didn't even know about, something that would prove crucial to the success of her plan. After the first banquet, Haman went home feeling elated and honored. He had been invited to a private dinner with the king and queen, a sign of incredible favor and privilege. He bragged to his wife and friends about his wealth, his many sons, his promotion by the king, and especially about being the only person besides the king invited to Queen Esther's banquet. But his joy was poisoned by one sight: Mordecai at the king's gate, still refusing to bow, still standing upright when everyone else showed honor to Haman. The text tells us that when Haman saw Mordecai, he was filled with rage, but he restrained himself and went home instead of causing a public scene. His wife Zeresh and his friends suggested a solution that revealed the depth of Haman's hatred and the extent of his power. Have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. 50 cubits is about 75 feet, an enormous gallows designed not just to execute Mordecai, but to make his death visible from miles away, a warning to anyone else who might consider defying Haman's authority. This wasn't just about eliminating a personal irritant. This was about sending a message that would terrorize the entire Jewish community. Haman loved the idea and immediately had the gallows constructed, planning to ask the king's permission first thing in the morning to hang Mordecai before attending Esther's second banquet. He went to bed that night, imagining the satisfaction of watching his enemy die in the most public and humiliating way possible. But that same night, King Xerxes couldn't sleep. Was this insomnia just a coincidence? In God's plans, are there ever really coincidences? How does God use even the smallest details of daily life to accomplish His larger purposes? Unable to sleep, the king ordered that the Book of Chronicles, the official record of his reign, be brought and read to him. This was probably a common practice when the king couldn't sleep. The dry recitation of official records might have a soporific effect, helping him relax and drift off. But of all the entries that could have been read, of all the events and decisions and appointments that had been recorded during his reign, the reader came to the account of how Mordecai had discovered the assassination plot and saved the king's life years earlier. When the king asked what honor or recognition had been given to Mordecai for this service, his servants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." The man who had saved the king's life had never been rewarded, recognized, or even thanked publicly for his crucial service. This disturbed the king's sense of justice and royal protocol. How could someone who had performed such an important service go unrewarded? What kind of king fails to honor those who risk their own safety for his benefit? This oversight needed to be corrected immediately. God controls even the sleep of kings and the reading choices of servants to accomplish His rescue plans. At the very moment when Haman was planning Mordecai's death, God was arranging for Mordecai to be honored by the very king Haman served. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was providential. Early the next morning, Haman came to the palace courtyard, eager to request permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared. But before he could make his request, the king called him in with a question: what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman, assuming the king was referring to him, because who else would the king want to honor more than his most trusted advisor, suggested the most elaborate honor he could imagine. For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." The king loved the suggestion. "Go at once," he commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Why does God often make our enemies become the instruments of our honor? Does pride always lead to a fall? How does God use the very schemes intended to harm His people to bring them blessing instead? Imagine Haman's shock, horror, and humiliation. The man he had planned to hang at dawn, he now had to honor with the highest recognition the empire could bestow. He had to dress Mordecai in royal robes, lead him through the streets of Susa on the king's own horse, and proclaim to everyone, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Every step of that procession must have been agony for Haman. Every word of proclamation must have tasted like poison in his mouth. The man he hated most in the world was being elevated and celebrated, and Haman himself was the instrument of that elevation. This is how God works. He turns the schemes of the wicked into their own downfall, and he uses even their evil intentions to bring honor to his people. The trap Haman had set for Mordecai became the means of Mordecai's greatest honor. The hatred that was supposed to destroy God's servant became the vehicle for demonstrating God's favor toward him. But there's something even more beautiful happening here. God was positioning Mordecai for the crisis that was about to unfold. When Esther revealed her Jewish identity and accused Haman of planning genocide, it would be crucial that Mordecai was seen not as a troublemaker or enemy of the state, but as a loyal servant who had been honored by the king himself. This public recognition would provide credibility and protection for the entire Jewish community when they most needed it. God's timing is always perfect. His preparation is always thorough. His justice may sometimes seem delayed, but it is never denied. That evening came the second banquet, and Esther knew that this time there could be no more delay. She had prepared as thoroughly as possible, built as much favor as she could, created the best possible circumstances for her request. Now it was time to risk everything on the truth. When King Xerxes again asked what she wanted, promising to give her anything up to half his kingdom, Esther finally made her request, but in a way that was both personal and political, both emotional and strategic. "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." Notice how brilliantly she framed her request. She didn't start with abstract principles of justice or religious freedom. She didn't begin with accusations against Haman or explanations of Jewish customs. She made it personal and immediate. "Grant me my life." She was asking the king to save her before she asked him to save her people. Then she explained why her life was in danger. "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." For the first time since becoming queen, she revealed that she was Jewish. The secret she had kept for years, the identity she had hidden to protect herself and serve her people, was now laid bare before the most powerful man in the world. The king was stunned. His beloved queen was part of the people group that Haman had convinced him to authorize for destruction. The woman he had chosen to share his throne, the person he trusted most intimately, was a member of the minority community he had unknowingly sentenced to death. Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? The king demanded. And Esther, with courage that had been building for years and crystallized in 3 days of fasting and prayer, pointed directly at Haman, an adversary and enemy. This vile Haman. Are there times when we must risk everything to protect others? How do we find courage to speak truth when it might harm us personally? What does it cost to finally stop hiding who we really are? This was Esther's moment of complete vulnerability and complete courage. She was no longer hiding behind her royal position or her Persian identity. She was standing fully in her true identity as one of God's chosen people, and she was willing to face whatever consequences came from that truth. She was also demonstrating something crucial about effective advocacy. She had built credibility and relationship before she revealed her cause. She had proven her loyalty to the king and her value as a queen before she asked him to act on behalf of her people. She had established trust before she made her request. But most importantly, she was willing to identify completely with those she was trying to save. She wasn't asking the king to help the Jewish people as an abstract humanitarian gesture. She was asking him to save her life and the lives of her family. She was making it impossible for him to remain neutral or detached. Truth will ultimately be revealed, and justice will ultimately be served. Sometimes we have to be the ones willing to speak that truth and demand that justice, regardless of the personal cost. The king's reaction was swift and dramatic. He got up from the banquet in rage and went out into the palace garden, probably needing time to process what he had just learned and decide how to respond. His trusted advisor had deceived him into authorizing the murder of his own wife. The woman he loved was facing death because of a decree he had signed. The man he had relied on for counsel had manipulated him into becoming an instrument of genocide. Haman, realizing that his life was now in mortal danger, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for mercy. But when the king returned from the garden and saw Haman falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, probably prostrating himself in desperation, he misinterpreted the scene and became even more enraged. "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" the king shouted. One of the king's eunuchs, Harbona, chose that moment to mention the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, the man who had saved the king's life. This detail pushed the king's anger to its breaking point. "Hang him on it," the king commanded. So Haman was executed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai, 75 feet above the ground, visible for miles around. The trap he had set for his enemy became his own destruction. The instrument of death he had prepared for the man he hated became the means of his own execution. Don't those who dig pits for others often fall into them themselves? How do we balance the justice of God with the mercy He calls us to show? What does it mean that God's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied? This is the ultimate irony of evil. It tends to destroy itself. The hatred that consumes the hater often becomes the weapon of their own destruction. The schemes designed to harm the innocent often backfire on those who devise them. The pride that refuses to bow to God often becomes the stumbling block that leads to complete downfall. Haman's death was poetic justice, but it was also a demonstration of God's protection of His people. The man who had planned their genocide died on the gallows he had prepared for their advocate. The enemy who had seemed so powerful and untouchable was revealed to be subject to the same king he had tried to manipulate. But Esther's work wasn't finished. Even though Haman was dead, his edict calling for the destruction of all Jews was still in effect. According to Persian law, a decree sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked even by the king himself. The legal machinery of genocide was still in motion, and the date of execution was still approaching. When we can't change the past, How do we create a new future? Sometimes do we have to fight rather than just pray? What does it mean to work within imperfect systems to achieve just outcomes? This presented a new challenge that required creative thinking, legal innovation, and political courage. How do you save a people when the law condemning them cannot be changed? How do you provide protection when you can't remove the threat? How do you ensure survival when the system itself has been turned against you? The answer came through King Xerxes' recognition that if he couldn't revoke Haman's decree, he could issue a new decree that would counteract it. He gave Esther and Mordecai permission to write another edict in the king's name, sealed with his ring, giving the Jewish people the right to defend themselves. This new decree was comprehensive and strategic. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of every nationality and province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. When is self-defense a moral responsibility? Does power always come with the responsibility to protect the weak? How do we balance the call to peace with the need to defend the innocent? This wasn't just permission for individual self-defense. This was authorization for organized community protection. The Jewish people could coordinate their defense, and take proactive action against anyone who tried to carry out Haman's original decree. They were transformed from helpless victims into an organized, legally protected community capable of defending themselves and their families. The new decree was sent out by the fastest messengers throughout the empire, carried by riders on swift horses from the royal stables. The same communication system that had spread the news of their intended destruction now carried the message of their empowerment and protection. When the 13th day of the 12th month arrived, the day that had been chosen for the destruction of the Jewish people, the tables were completely turned. Instead of being victims, the Jewish people became victorious. Instead of facing extinction, they experienced deliverance. Instead of mourning, there was celebration. The text tells us that the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. This wasn't indiscriminate violence. This was targeted defense against those who had planned to participate in genocide. The Jewish communities defended themselves against attackers while protecting those who had chosen not to participate in Haman's scheme. But something even more remarkable happened. Many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. The demonstration of God's protection and the Jewish people's courage led to conversions throughout the empire. People who had witnessed this dramatic reversal of fortune recognized that the God of the Jews was more powerful than the gods of Persia, and they chose to align themselves with his people. How can one day of darkness become a day of light? Does the victory of the righteous always influence others toward righteousness? What happens when God's people demonstrate both his justice and his mercy? This is the power of God working through ordinary people who make extraordinary choices. Esther's courage didn't just save her people, it created a movement that brought many others into relationship with the true God. Her willingness to risk everything for others became a testimony to God's faithfulness that spread throughout the known world. Instead of the Jewish people being destroyed, their enemies were defeated. Instead of their property being plundered, they gained wealth from those who had planned to rob them. Instead of their community being scattered, it was strengthened and enlarged. Instead of their faith being eliminated, it was vindicated and spread to other peoples. This is what happens when God's people choose courage over comfort, sacrifice over safety, faith over fear. The victory doesn't just benefit them, it demonstrates God's power and attracts others to His kingdom. Mordecai and Esther established the festival of Purim, to be celebrated every year on the 14th and 15th days of Adar, so that the Jewish people would never forget how God had delivered them from destruction. The name Purim comes from the lots pur that Haman had cast to determine the date of the planned massacre, a reminder that what seemed like random chance was actually divine providence. Why do we need to celebrate past victories? How do we pass faith to the next generation? What is the importance of remembering God's faithfulness in previous crises? The festival included feasting joy, giving gifts to one another, and providing charity to the poor. But the central element was the reading of the entire book of Esther, so that every generation would hear the story of how one woman's courage had saved an entire people. The importance of remembrance cannot be overstated. What God has done in the past becomes the foundation for faith in the future. Every generation needs to hear the stories of God's faithfulness, His power to deliver, His ability to use ordinary people for extraordinary purposes, and His commitment to protect those who trust in Him. But the story of Esther is more than just historical record. It's a pattern that has been repeated throughout history whenever God's people have faced extinction, and He has raised up deliverers to save them. It's a template for understanding how God works through human courage, divine providence, and perfect timing to accomplish His purposes in the world. So what does this ancient story mean for us today? What lessons can we draw from Esther's example? How does her courage inspire and challenge us in our own generation? First, let's consider who God chooses to accomplish His purposes. The answer might surprise you. He consistently chooses people who seem to have nothing special about them by the world's standards. Orphans, like Esther, minorities, facing discrimination, women in male-dominated societies, people who feel inadequate and unprepared for the tasks before them. Esther was an orphan with no family wealth or political connections. She was a woman in a culture that gave women little power or influence. She was a Jew in a Persian empire where her people were seen as foreign and potentially dangerous. She was young and inexperienced in the complexities of imperial politics. By any human calculation, she was an unlikely candidate to save an entire people from genocide. But she had something that mattered more than natural ability or social advantage, a heart willing to obey God and courage to act when it mattered most. She had learned to trust God rather than circumstances, to depend on His strength rather than her own resources, to seek His guidance rather than rely on her own understanding. Do you feel like you're not capable enough for God to use you? What makes someone special in God's eyes? How does God view qualifications differently than the world does? God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. He doesn't look for people who have all the answers. He looks for people who will trust Him to provide the answers when they're needed. He doesn't choose people who feel ready. He chooses people who will become ready through dependence on Him. Throughout Scripture, this is the pattern we see repeated. God chooses David, the youngest son, who was overlooked by his own family, to become the greatest king in Israel's history. He chooses Moses, who felt too slow of speech, to be a leader to deliver his people from Egypt. He chooses Mary, a teenage girl from a small town, to be the mother of the Messiah. He chooses fishermen and tax collectors to be apostles who would change the world. The common thread isn't natural ability or social status. It's availability to God and willingness to trust Him with outcomes that seem impossible by human standards. If God consistently chooses unlikely people for His most important work, then your background, your limitations, your past failures, and your present circumstances don't disqualify you from being used by Him. They might actually be the very things that prepare you to depend on His strength rather than your own. Second, let's think about timing and purpose. Such a time as this. Every person has their own moments when they're positioned to make a difference that goes far beyond their personal interests or comfort. These moments rarely come with clear instructions or guaranteed outcomes. They usually require us to risk what we have for what might be possible. Maybe your such a time as this is in your family, where you're the only one willing to speak truth in love to someone who is destroying their life with destructive choices. Maybe it's in your workplace, where you have the opportunity to defend a colleague who is being treated unfairly, even though standing up might cost you political capital or advancement opportunities. Maybe it's in your community, where you see injustice or need that others are ignoring, and you have the resources, influence, or platform to make a difference. Maybe it's in your church or ministry, where you have insights or abilities that could help solve problems or reach people who are being overlooked. Maybe it's in your sphere of influence, however large or small, where you have the chance to model integrity, courage, compassion, or faithfulness in ways that could inspire others to do the same. Where has God placed you that you could make a difference? What relationships, positions, opportunities, or resources do you have that could be used for purposes greater than your own benefit? The key to recognizing such a time as this moments is understanding that they're rarely convenient, comfortable, or risk-free. They usually require us to step outside our comfort zones, to trust God with outcomes we can't control, to put other people's needs ahead of our own preferences. But they're also opportunities to participate in God's work in the world, to be part of solutions rather than just observers of problems, to discover that our lives can have significance that goes far beyond our personal happiness or success. Sometimes we're placed in positions not to enjoy the benefits, but to use the influence for others. Your such a time as this might be happening right now, and you might not even realize it. Third, let's examine what courage looks like in our generation. It doesn't always look like heroic action or dramatic confrontation. It often looks much more ordinary, but no less important. Courage might be telling the truth in a meeting when everyone else is staying silent about a problem they all know exists. It might be defending someone who's being gossiped about or excluded from social circles. It might be refusing to participate in conversations or activities that compromise your values, even when that refusal makes you seem judgmental or antisocial. Courage might be having a difficult conversation with a family member about their destructive behavior, knowing that they might get angry and cut off relationship with you. It might be confronting a friend about choices that are harming them, or others risking the friendship for the sake of their well-being. Courage might be standing up for biblical truth in environments where those truths are unpopular or considered offensive. It might be maintaining your integrity in business dealings when cutting corners would be more profitable. It might be choosing to serve others when advancement would require you to step on people or ignore their needs. What is your Goliath in this generation? What fears, pressures, or obstacles are keeping you from doing what you know is right? How will you respond to God's call when it comes in ways you don't expect? Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking action despite fear. Even Esther was afraid when she decided to approach the king. Even Jesus experienced intense emotional distress in the Garden of Gethsemane as he contemplated the cross. Fear is a natural human response to danger or uncertainty. The difference between courage and cowardice isn't the presence or absence of fear. It's the choice to do what's right even when you're afraid. It's the decision to trust God's character and promises even when you can't see how things will work out. And God promises to provide strength when we need it, wisdom when we ask for it, and favor when we step out in faith for purposes that align with His heart and will. Fourth, let's consider the legacy of courageous decisions. One decision made in faith. One choice to put others' needs ahead of our own safety. One moment of standing up when everyone else sits down. These single acts can have consequences that ripple through generations. Esther didn't just save her own generation of Jewish people. She saved all the generations that would come after them. Every Jewish person alive today exists because a young woman was willing to say, "If I perish, I perish," and risk everything to save her people. But the impact goes even further than that. Her story has inspired countless people throughout history to find courage in their own desperate situations, to trust God when circumstances seemed hopeless, to risk everything for purposes greater than personal safety or comfort. Her example teaches us that God can use anyone who is willing to be used, that timing is often more important than talent, that influence built on character is more powerful than influence built on position, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up and be willing to act when action is required. What legacy do you want to leave for the next generation? How will your decisions today affect others in the future? What will people remember about your life when you're gone? These aren't just abstract questions. They're invitations to think about our lives in terms of eternal significance rather than temporary comfort. They're challenges to consider whether we're living for ourselves or for purposes that will outlast our brief time on earth. God uses our obedience to bless many people, often in ways we'll never fully understand this side of heaven. The courage you show today, the stand you take tomorrow, the sacrifice you make next week, these choices could have consequences that extend far beyond what you can see or imagine. But even if the consequences are smaller than Esther's, even if your sphere of influence seems limited, even if your opportunities seem ordinary, God can use your faithfulness to make a difference in ways that matter eternally. Now let me ask you 3 crucial questions that could change the trajectory of your life. First, where has God placed you that you could make a difference? Look honestly at your relationships, your workplace, your community, your sphere of influence. Consider your resources, your skills, your opportunities, your platform. You're there for a reason, and that reason probably involves more than just your personal benefit or success. Maybe you're the only believer in your workplace positioned to demonstrate what integrity looks like in a secular environment. Maybe you're the only person in your family who has the courage to address problems that everyone else is ignoring. Maybe you're the only one in your community with the resources or connections to help solve a particular problem. Maybe you're the only person in your circle of friends who has the spiritual maturity to speak truth in love to someone who desperately needs to hear it. Maybe you're the only one in your church or ministry with the combination of abilities needed to tackle a particular challenge or reach a particular group of people. Where are you positioned right now that you could make a difference? Who are the Mordecais in your life who are calling you to courage? What opportunities do you have that you might be taking for granted or undervaluing? Second, is there someone who needs you to speak up for them? This might be the most important question you consider today. Look around you. At work, in your family, in your neighborhood, in your church, in your community. Is there someone being treated unfairly? Someone being bullied or marginalized? Someone whose voice isn't being heard? Someone who needs an advocate? Maybe it's a colleague who is being blamed for someone else's mistakes. Maybe it's a child who is being bullied at school. Maybe it's an elderly person who is being mistreated or neglected. Maybe it's someone from a minority group who is facing discrimination. Maybe it's someone with unpopular opinions who is being silenced or shamed. Maybe it's someone in your family who is being scapegoated or excluded. Maybe it's someone in your church who is being judged unfairly. Maybe it's someone in your community who needs services or support that aren't being provided, who needs you to be their Esther, who needs you to risk your comfort or reputation for their well-being, who would benefit from your influence, your voice, your resources, or your support. This question challenges us to move beyond self-focus to other focus, beyond self-protection to service, beyond maintaining our own comfort to promoting others' welfare. Third, what are you willing to say? If I perish, I perish? 4. This is perhaps the most challenging question of all. What principles, what people, what purposes are worth risking? Your comfort, your reputation, your security, even your life. For Esther, it was the survival of her people. For other believers throughout history, it has been the spread of the gospel, the defense of biblical truth, the protection of the innocent, the pursuit of justice, the care of the poor and marginalized. What would it take for you to say, "This is so important that I'm willing to risk everything for it"? What injustice would motivate you to speak up even if it cost you professionally? What truth would you be willing to defend, even if it made you unpopular? What person would you be willing to sacrifice for? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary questions. They reveal what we really value, what we truly believe, what actually motivates us at the deepest level. They separate genuine faith from cultural Christianity, authentic love from sentimental feelings, real character from convenient morality. God is waiting for your answer to these questions. He's positioned you exactly where you are for reasons you may not fully understand yet, but His timing is perfect, and His purposes are good. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is whether you're available. The question isn't whether you're strong enough. The question is whether you trust God to be strong through you. You don't have to start with something dramatic or life-changing. Maybe it begins with something as simple as listening to someone who needs comfort, defending someone who is being criticized unfairly, sharing your faith in a gentle and loving way, or providing practical help to someone who is struggling. What's the smallest step you could take today? Who around you needs encouragement, support, or advocacy? What opportunity do you have right now to make a positive difference in someone's life? Small steps can lead to significant changes. God often prepares us for bigger callings through smaller acts of faithfulness. He builds our courage, gradually develops our character incrementally, and expands our influence as we prove trustworthy with what He's already given us. But whatever you do, don't wait for perfect circumstances or complete clarity about outcomes. Esther didn't have guarantees when she decided to approach the king. She didn't know how her story would end when she chose to identify with her people. She just knew that staying silent was worse than taking action, that letting others suffer while she stayed safe was unacceptable. Like Esther, we need spiritual preparation for whatever challenges we're facing or will face. The importance of prayer and fasting, of seeking God's guidance before taking action, of finding support from our community of faith, of preparing our hearts for whatever consequences our obedience might bring. Are you spiritually preparing for your calling? Who will pray with you as you seek God's will? What spiritual disciplines are you practicing to build the character and faith you'll need for whatever challenges lie ahead? Spiritual strength is the foundation for every other kind of action. We can't give what we don't have, and we can't lead others where we haven't been ourselves. The courage we need for external challenges must be built through internal spiritual development. And here's God's promise to you, the same promise that sustained Esther and has sustained believers throughout history. He will never leave you or forsake you. He will provide strength when you need it. His plans for you are good. You can trust in His faithfulness even when you can't see the full picture. Do you believe God has good plans for your life? How can you live in that trust rather than in fear of what might happen if you step out in faith? The Bible tells us, "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. This promise sustained Esther through her darkest moments of decision, and it can sustain you through whatever challenges you're facing. But God's idea of prosperity and our idea of prosperity might be different. His plans for our good might include temporary difficulty, sacrifice, or even suffering, if those experiences are necessary to accomplish His purposes through us and develop His character in us. The transformation from Hadassah to Esther represents something available to all of us. The journey from being protected to becoming a protector, from being saved to becoming a savior for others, from being ordinary to being used by God in extraordinary ways. This transformation doesn't happen automatically or instantly. It's the result of countless small choices to trust God rather than circumstances to obey Him, rather than popular opinion to serve others, rather than just ourselves. It's developed through experiences that stretch our faith, challenge our assumptions, and force us to depend on God's strength rather than our own resources. God transforms ordinary people into extraordinary instruments of His purposes. Your background, your limitations, your fears, your past failures, none of these disqualify you from being used by God. They might actually be the very things that prepare you to depend on Him rather than yourself, to give Him glory, rather than taking credit, to relate to others who are struggling rather than looking down on them. Esther's story didn't end 2,500 years ago in ancient Persia. Every generation has its own Esthers, people who have the courage to stand up when no one else will, who are willing to risk their own comfort and safety for the sake of others, who understand that sometimes one person really can change the course of history. In the 20th century, we saw Esther's courage in people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who opposed the Nazi regime and was executed for his involvement in plots against Hitler. We saw it in Corrie ten Boom, who hid Jewish families during the Holocaust and was imprisoned in concentration camps. We saw it in Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her bus seat sparked the Montgomery bus boycott and helped launch the civil rights movement. We've seen it in countless missionaries who left comfort and safety to carry the gospel to dangerous places. We've seen it in pastors who preach truth even when it costs them their congregations or their freedom. We've seen it in ordinary believers who stood up to injustice in their workplaces, their communities, their families, even when standing up meant standing alone. History is written by those who make courageous decisions when courage is costly. What chapter will you write in this ongoing story? Will you be remembered as someone who stood up when it mattered, or someone who stayed seated when others needed you to act? The question isn't whether you're qualified to make a difference. The question is whether you're willing to be used by God despite your qualifications. The question isn't whether you're strong enough for the challenges ahead. The question is whether you trust God to be strong through you. The question isn't whether you have all the answers. The question is whether you're willing to take the next step in faith. I want to invite you to become the Esther of your generation in whatever sphere of influence God has placed you. You don't have to wait for the perfect opportunity or the ideal circumstances. You don't have to have a complete plan or guaranteed outcomes. You just have to be willing to start where you are with what you have, trusting that God will use your obedience to accomplish purposes you can't even imagine. Will you share this story with someone who needs encouragement to find their own courage? Will you pray for guidance about your own calling and purpose? Will you look for community to support you in your spiritual journey? Will you take some action, however small today, to serve others or stand up for what's right? And as you do, remember that you're part of a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. But your chapter matters. Your decisions matter. Your courage matters. Your willingness to say, "If I perish, for purposes greater than yourself, could change everything for people you don't even know yet. In the weeks and months ahead, as you face your own such a time as this moments, remember Esther's example. Remember that God specializes in using unlikely people for impossible tasks. Remember that His strength is made perfect in weakness. His wisdom is available to those who ask, and His favor rests on those who step out in faith for purposes that align with His heart. The world is waiting for your answer. God is waiting for your obedience. History is waiting for your courage. The same God who positioned Esther perfectly for her purpose has positioned you perfectly for yours. The same God who gave her courage when she needed it will give you courage when you need it. The same God who worked through her circumstances to save an entire people can work through your circumstances to accomplish His purposes in your generation. If you've never done so before, will you trust your life to this God, the God who specializes in using ordinary people for extraordinary purposes, who delights in choosing the weak to shame the strong, who loves to demonstrate His power through those who have learned to depend on Him? The choice is yours. The time is now. And like Esther, you might just discover that the very situation you've been trying to avoid, the very challenge you've been hoping someone else would handle, the very risk you've been afraid to take, that's exactly where God wants to use you most powerfully. Because sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones God uses to write the most incredible stories. Sometimes the most broken people become the most beautiful demonstrations of His grace. Sometimes the most frightened people become the most powerful examples of His strength.
Will you be one of them? Will you find the courage to stand when no one else will? Will you be willing to say, "If I perish, I perish," for purposes that matter more than your personal comfort or safety? The story of Esther continues in every generation, and it continues in you. The only question is, what will your chapter say?